The morning sun had scarcely risen over St. Mary's on the Hill, casting a gentle gold across the manicured lawns of Rosewood Manor. The village was alive with anticipation. It was not every week that Lady Penelope Ashcroft, the manor's gracious mistress, hosted her renowned spring garden party. Tables adorned with fine china and crystal gleamed beneath the sprawling magnolia trees, while delicate scents of lavender and rose mingled in the air. Miss Marple, as always, had arrived earlier than most, her keen eyes taking in the familiar faces with quiet curiosity. She had learned long ago that social gatherings in small villages often revealed more than the local gossip columns could ever hope to print. Today, though, she was here under the guise of simply enjoying a cup of Lady Penelope's famed Earl Grey. The guests began to trickle in, a mix of aristocrats, merchants, and townsfolk who cherished any excuse to promenade along the manor's flower-lined paths. Among them was young Charles Withers, recently returned from a stint in London, who immediately became the centre of whispered attention. His sharp suits and confident manner contrasted with his rather elusive smile. Close by Mrs. was Gladys Herring, a widow notorious for her talent in overhearing and exaggerating everything, tilted her hat and scanned the crowd for fresh gossip. As the clock struck 11, a gentle clatter drew attention toward the central fountain. There, on the marble edge, lay the body of Sir Reginald Thorne, the manor's most illustrious and perhaps most infuriating guest. His once crisp morning coat was stained with a dark splotch that Miss Marple instantly recognised. It was not wine nor tea, it was far grimmer. His hand, curiously clutching a small velvet box, trembled slightly as if frozen in a silent plea. The initial gasp from the crowd seemed almost theatrical, yet within moments, reality settled in with dreadful clarity. Sir Reginald Thorne was dead. The serene morning, the laughter of children chasing butterflies, the clinking of silver spoons against teacups, all vanished like mist. Inspector Cray, a competent but rather unimaginative man from the nearby town, arrived almost immediately. His brow furrowed as he surveyed the scene, barking orders at constables and the ever-present Lady Penelope, who fluttered like a distressed bird. "Nobody leaves, nobody touches anything, this is a crime scene," he shouted, though his voice lacked the subtle finesse Miss Marple had seen in seasoned detectives of the Metropolitan Force. Yet it was not the inspector who commanded Miss Marple's attention. It was the curious expression on Charles Withers' face as he hovered near the body, one hand shielding the velvet box, the other brushing nervously against his jaw. And then there was Mrs. Gladys Herring, who had managed to drop her parasol in her rush to witness the tragedy firsthand. Such minor reactions, trivial as they seemed, were precisely what Miss Marple stored in the quiet compartments of her mind, where human nature revealed itself in the subtlest of ways. Lady Penelope, regaining some semblance of composure, attempted to soothe the gathering crowd. It must be an accident," she stammered. But the pall of unease had already descended. In a village so small that everyone knew everyone else's business, accidents of this magnitude were rarely ever accidents. Miss Marple, sipping her tea with unaffected serenity, allowed herself a small inward sigh. Beneath the polite laughter and the polite panic, she sensed a knot of tension, of secrecy, of ambition, all tangled tightly around the unfortunate Sir Reginald. And somewhere within that tangled web the truth awaited, patient, hidden, and waiting for a careful observer to untangle it. She glanced at the velvet box in Sir Reginald's hand once more, noting a faint engraving on its surface, half hidden by his rigid fingers. A wedding ring, perhaps? Or a clue? She could not be certain yet, but Miss Marple had learned that the smallest details often carried the greatest significance. And so the garden party meant to celebrate spring's gentle bloom had become a stage for a far more sinister revelation. Miss Marple, quiet as a shadow, resolved to watch, listen and understand, for in villages like St. Fian, Mary's on the Hill, appearances were always deceiving and secrets like roots beneath the soil were deep indeed. The news of Sir Reginald's death spread through St. Mary's on the Hill with astonishing speed. By noon, the village seemed caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. The bakery was filled with murmurs, the post office echoed with speculation, and the church bell tolled with a solemnity that seemed almost accusatory. Everyone had their own theory, and each new version seemed to grow more extravagant than the last. Mrs. Gladys Herring, in particular, thrived amidst the chaos. She recounted in minute detail how Sir Reginald had tripped near the fountain, how Charles Withers had looked peculiarly anxious, and how the velvet box might hold a secret, so scandalous it could shake the village to its core. She spoke to anyone who would listen, embellishing slightly with each retelling, confident that her role as the bearer of gossip elevated her importance. Meanwhile, other villagers whispered about motives. Some recalled old quarrels, Sir Reginald's sharp tongue had offended more than a few neighbours over the years. Others remembered the time he had insisted on a loan repayment from the recently widowed Mrs. Penrose, though she had claimed she had paid it decades ago. Young couples speculated wildly about secret engagements and clandestine affairs, their imaginations fueled by the sinister air surrounding the morning's events. At Rosewood Manor, Inspector Cray attempted to corral the facts, but his efforts were repeatedly undermined by the conflicting testimonies and the village's natural tendency toward dramatisation. Miss Marple, seated discreetly on a shaded bench near the magnolia trees, observed the parade of suspicion and conjecture with her customary patience. She noted the subtle shifts in posture, the way some villagers avoided certain gazes, the little gestures that revealed far more than words ever could. She watched Charles Withers again, who seemed increasingly unsettled as he moved among the guests. He was polite, smiling when prompted, yet there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it fear, guilt, or simply the shock of witnessing a death so abruptly? Miss Marple did not presume. She catalogued. Every detail, every glance, every hesitation might prove significant in time. Lady Penelope, visibly shaken but determined to maintain some decorum, gathered a few close friends to help calm the crowd. She offered tea and reassurances, though even she could not disguise the tremor in her voice. Her eyes kept darting toward the fountain, where Sir Reginald's body had been carefully covered with a white cloth by the authorities. As the afternoon wore on, the initial frenzy began to settle into a tense, uneasy quiet. Villagers lingered, reluctant to leave without hearing some resolution, yet increasingly aware that answers were not forthcoming. Miss Marple wandered slowly along the pathways, her mind quietly piecing together fragments of information. She considered the placement of the velvet box, the way Sir Reginald had been positioned, and the expressions of those surrounding him when the body was discovered. Each observation added another thread to a growing tapestry she alone could begin to understand. By late afternoon, a few of the more rational villagers returned to their homes, though the buzz of speculation continued to ripple through the streets. Miss Marple found herself drawn toward the fountain once more, noting a faint scuff on the marble edge, almost imperceptible. It was easy to miss, and yet in a small village, nothing ever remained truly hidden. She touched her chin thoughtfully, considering how small actions, minor disputes, or old grudges could culminate in such a shocking act. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gardens. Miss Marple remained calm, her gaze steady, her mind working quietly. She knew the truth was not in the chaos of gossip nor in the initial assumptions of Inspector Cray. It was in the subtle interplay of human behaviour, in the half-told stories, in the secrets that villagers guarded so carefully, and she intended to unravel every one of them one by one, until the morning's horror made sense. Miss Marple spent the evening in quiet reflection, seated by the drawing-room window of Rosewood Manor, while the manor itself hummed with a subdued tension. The guests who had remained were gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, each conversation carefully avoiding the fountain and the tragedy that had occurred there. Even Lady Penelope, ever the gracious hostess, had retreated behind a veneer of composed civility, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she poured tea for the few who remained. Inspector Cray, for his part, had begun his preliminary inquiries, though he relied heavily on the villagers' immediate accounts rather than a careful examination of facts. Miss Marple listened politely as he questioned various guests, noting how his questions often invited more speculation than clarity. One after another, villagers offered their impressions of Sir Reginald's final moments, some contradicting others, yet each revealing a fragment of truth hidden beneath layers of assumption. Charles Withers, who had been unusually tense during the day, now seemed more withdrawn, seated near the hearth with his gaze fixed on the fire rather than the room. Miss Marple observed him with gentle curiosity. There was a subtle rigidity in the way he held himself, a measured caution in his movements, and a fleeting shadow of unease that passed over his face whenever the conversation turned to the morning's incident. Nothing about him demanded immediate accusation, yet there was enough to warrant careful consideration. Meanwhile, Mrs. Nins, Gladys Herring, undeterred by any notion of propriety, flitted from group to group, recounting her version of events with increasing embellishment. "I saw him, right there by the fountain, and that box. Oh, such a curious thing for a man to carry," she whispered, glancing around to ensure her audience was suitably impressed by the scandal she implied. Miss Marple made a mental note of the widow's penchant for exaggeration, recognizing that while her observations were often unreliable, the small truths buried within them could sometimes illuminate hidden realities. As night descended, the conversation inevitably turned toward motives. Villagers speculated on grievances both recent and long past. Debts owed, insults remembered, romantic entanglements suspected. Miss Marple, however, noted the careful omissions as keenly as the spoken accusations. The things left unsaid, the nervous glance, the quick change of subject, the subtle avoidance of certain topics, spoke volumes about the quiet tensions that underlay the village's placid exterior. In a moment of quiet, she observed Lady Penelope moving towards the veranda, carrying the now empty velvet box. The lady's hands were steady, yet her expression betrayed a fleeting worry, as though the object held more significance than any outwardly acknowledged. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The box itself, innocuous though it appeared, might contain more than a simple token. Often the smallest of objects held the largest clues, she thought, recalling countless cases where a detail dismissed by all others proved decisive. Later, as the manor settled into a muted evening hush, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the gardens. The moonlight cast silvery shadows across the flower beds, the fountains and the paths that wound through the estate. She paused near the marble edge of the central fountain, her fingers brushing lightly over the faint scuff she had noticed earlier. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it suggested movement, struggle, or perhaps the carelessness of someone in a hurry. Small, overlooked details often betrayed far more than shouted accusations ever could. Returning to the drawing room, she observed the remaining guests once more. Charles Withers had not moved from his seat by the fire, yet she detected a subtle change in his posture, a fleeting tightening of his jaw that seemed almost imperceptible to anyone else. Mrs. Herring was asleep in her chair, exhausted from a day of social manoeuvring, and Lady Penelope had retreated into a corner, speaking in quiet tones with her closest confidant. The room, though outwardly calm, hummed with unspoken tension, with layers of truth and deception intertwined like the intricate patterns of a tapestry. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed herself a faint smile. The threads were beginning to reveal themselves, quietly, subtly, in the way people moved, in the way they avoided certain subjects, and in the silent weight of objects like the velvet box. The task ahead would require patience, observation, and an understanding of human nature deeper than the surface of polite society, and she was ready to unravel it all, one careful step at a time. The following morning brought with it a quiet, tense air, as though the village itself hesitated to breathe. News of Sir Reginald's death had settled like a fog over St. Mary's on the hill, and the streets were unusually subdued. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones, children lingered close to their mothers, and even the parish priest seemed unusually solemn. Rosewood Manor, once a place of lively chatter and delicate laughter, had become a hub of subdued activity, where every glance and gesture seemed charged with unspoken meaning. Inspector Cray resumed his inquiries, pacing the drawing room with a sense of urgency that bordered on theatrical. Miss Marple, seated quietly by a lace-curtained window, allowed him to question her without comment, noting the ways he focused on obvious facts while neglecting subtler human cues. He asked about Sir Reginald's last interactions, about any arguments or quarrels, and about the presence of the velvet box. Miss Marple answered politely, revealing only what seemed innocuous, while her mind catalogued inconsistencies and half-truths whispered by other guests the day before. Charles Withers appeared once again, though his demeanour had changed. He moved carefully, with measured steps, speaking little and avoiding prolonged eye contact. Yet even in his silence, Miss Marple observed nuances that spoke volumes. A slight tightening of the lips when a particular subject arose, a barely perceptible fidget with his cuff, and a certain vigilance in the way he scanned the room. These were not the overt signs of guilt, perhaps, but they suggested tension, awareness, and the subtle anxiety of someone entangled in circumstances he would rather avoid. Mrs. Herring had recovered her energy overnight and was already circulating among the servants, whispering about imagined motives and possible romantic entanglements. "I told you," she said triumphantly to the housekeeper, "there was something odd about that box, something no one else noticed." Her insistence on importance, however, only highlighted the unreliability of her testimony, yet Miss Marple made note of the glimpses of truth buried beneath her flamboyant claims. Meanwhile, Lady Penelope struggled to maintain her composure, attending to her duties as hostess while simultaneously assisting Inspector Cray with his line of questioning. She spoke of Sir Reginald's last evening, recalling his polite greetings and the casual conversations he had shared with several guests. Miss Marple noted the slight hesitations in her speech when she mentioned Charles Withers, the subtle pause when she referenced the velvet box. These small cues, imperceptible to most, suggested a layer of complexity beneath Lady Penelope's outward poise. As the morning progressed, The inspector moved the focus to the sequence of events leading up to the discovery of the body. Witnesses described seeing Sir Reginald near the fountain gesturing animatedly and then, moments later, collapsed. The velvet box, clutched tightly in his hand, remained a point of fascination. Miss Marple, considering its placement and the way it had been grasped, speculated silently that it had been intended for someone, perhaps as a gift, perhaps as a message, and that its significance extended beyond mere sentimentality. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple wandered through the gardens, retracing the steps of the unfortunate man whose death had so unsettled the village. She examined the faint scuff marks on the marble edge, the slight disturbances in the gravel, the small indications of hurried movement. Each observation built upon the last, creating a subtle but increasingly coherent picture of what had occurred. Nothing was random, nothing inconsequential. In the small interwoven lives of St. Mary's on the Hill, every gesture, glance and object carried weight. By mid-afternoon, a sense of unease had settled over the manor. Guests had begun to depart, yet the tension lingered like an invisible thread binding everyone together. Miss Marple, quiet as ever, remained in the drawing-room, her eyes sweeping the room, her mind connecting the smallest of details. The velvet box, the behaviour of Charles Withers, the subtleties in Lady Penelope's speech, the exaggerated tales of Mrs. Herring, all pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal more than anyone suspected. And Miss Marple knew that the key to the truth was not in the loud statements of the villagers, but in their quiet hesitations, their fleeting gestures, and the secrets they believed were carefully hidden. The following day, Rosewood Manor resumed its quiet rhythm, though a lingering tension clung to the air like morning mist. Villagers returned to their routines, yet every glance, every conversation carried the shadow of Sir Reginald's death. Miss Marple, as always, moved through this delicate web of observation with the gentle patience of a gardener tending fragile blooms. She had learned long ago that the smallest gestures often revealed what the loudest words attempted to conceal. Inspector Cray was already at the manor when Miss Marple arrived, pacing the hallways with an intensity that contrasted sharply with her own calm demeanour. He had begun to form a preliminary list of suspects, largely guided by obvious motives and circumstantial evidence. Miss Marple listened carefully as he rattled off names and grievances, noting the certainties he clung to and the assumptions he ignored. There was much to be learned, she thought, by watching how he sought conclusions where questions might be more revealing. Charles Withers appeared again, this time in conversation with Lady Penelope. His tone was deferential, his gestures careful, yet Miss Marple observed subtle cracks in his composure. A flicker of impatience when he thought no one was watching, a brief hesitation before he answered Lady Penelope's questions, and the ever-present awareness of the velvet box still carefully placed upon a side table. It was a small object, unassuming in its appearance, yet Miss Marple suspected it held a significance greater than any of the guests realised. Throughout the morning, villagers arrived at the manor under various pretexts, to inquire about funeral arrangements, to express condolences, or simply to satisfy their curiosity. Each visitor brought a mixture of information and misdirection. Some inadvertently revealed grudges long buried, others hinted at resentments, while a few offered glimpses into relationships that had been carefully concealed. Miss Marple catalogued these revelations quietly, her mind weaving them into a tapestry that began to suggest patterns invisible to the casual observer. Mrs. Herring, predictably, was not to be ignored. She flitted from room to room, recounting tales she claimed to have witnessed the day before, exaggerating with her usual flair. Yet even in her hyperbole, Miss Marple noted inconsistencies, discrepancies that hinted at truths far more subtle than the widow's dramatic narrations. It was in these contradictions, Miss Marple knew, that the faint outlines of reality often emerged. By midday, a crucial detail caught Miss Marple's attention. The scuff on the marble fountain, which had seemed minor before, now appeared to tell a story of hurried movement and perhaps even struggle. Its position suggested someone had approached the fountain from an unexpected angle, and the direction of the gravel disturbance indicated a moment of pause, hesitation, or perhaps confrontation. Miss Marple committed this detail to memory, aware that it might serve as a silent witness to the morning's fatal events. Later, as the manor's staff quietly went about their duties, Miss Marple observed Lady Penelope conferring with a close neighbour in a secluded corner. Their conversation was subdued, yet the subtle expressions, the narrowing of eyes, the slight tremor of the lips, the momentary glance toward the side table, suggested concern that went beyond the obvious. Miss Marple, sensitive to such nuances, made note of these reactions, understanding that the outward civility of the village often masked deeper unspoken anxieties. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the gardens, Miss Marple took a solitary stroll along the winding paths, reviewing the day's observations in her mind. Each glance, each gesture, each hesitant word contributed to a growing mosaic of possibilities. The truth, she reflected, was seldom shouted or declared. It revealed itself quietly, patiently, through the behaviour of those who thought they were concealing it. And somewhere within the interplay of gestures, glances and small objects, the key to Sir Reginald's death awaited, hidden in plain sight yet overlooked by all but the most attentive observer. By the late afternoon, Rosewood Manor had acquired a strange stillness, broken only by the occasional footstep of a nervous servant or the muted ticking of a grandfather clock. The tragedy of Sir Reginald's death had settled into the rhythm of the household, yet the tension remained palpable, woven into the very air. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly among the guests and staff, her keen eyes noting the smallest gestures that others dismissed. Charles Withers had taken a seat near the drawing-room window, ostensibly reading a letter, but Miss Marple observed the restless movements of his hands and the intermittent flickers of his gaze toward the side table where the velvet box rested. His composure was meticulous, yet there were subtle hints of anxiety, slight changes in breathing, a brief tightening around his mouth, the careful avoidance of any prolonged eye contact with Lady Penelope or the inspector. Each motion was catalogued by Miss Marple, forming a mosaic of unease that spoke volumes about the young man's involvement, or at least his awareness of circumstances he wished to conceal. Lady Penelope, ever poised, attempted to restore a sense of normality. She moved among the remaining guests with gentle grace, offering tea and pastries, yet her eyes constantly flicked toward the velvet box, and she seemed to measure every word, spoken within earshot. Miss Marple noticed a particular tension in her posture when the discussion turned to Sir Reginald's finances and the box's contents. Though Lady Penelope maintained an air of civility, there was a restraint in her gestures that suggested a private worry she would not voice aloud. The villagers who lingered had begun to settle into quieter speculations. Mrs. Gladys Herring, after an energetic morning of retelling events with dramatic embellishment, had finally taken a seat, muttering to herself, while eyeing Charles Withers. Suspiciously, even in her fatigue, the sharp observations hidden beneath her gossip surfaced. A raised eyebrow, a sideways glance, a barely perceptible nod toward the side table. Miss Marple made careful note, understanding that such small unconscious movements often revealed more than elaborate stories ever could. In the gardens, the faint scuff marks near the fountain drew Miss Marple's attention once again. She knelt slightly, examining the pattern of the disturbance in the gravel, the subtle indentation in the marble, and the delicate footprints that suggested someone had approached the fountain in a deliberate yet cautious manner. The positioning of the footprints implied a pause, a hesitation, perhaps a confrontation. The evidence was slight, almost invisible, yet it spoke clearly to an observer attuned to human behaviour rather than mere physicality. Later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened and sunlight filtered softly through the drawing-room curtains, Miss Marple observed a subtle interaction between Lady Penelope and a local farmer, Mr. Aldridge. Their conversation was quiet, almost conspiratorial, yet there was a tension in the slight nods and careful phrasing. Miss Marple interpreted these signs as the acknowledgement of a shared concern, something neither wished to articulate fully, yet both recognised. In a village where everyone knew one another, even such discreet exchanges could reveal hidden alliances, unspoken suspicions, and motives concealed beneath layers of courtesy. As evening approached, Miss Marple retreated momentarily to her own room to collect her thoughts. She reflected on the day's observations, the anxious glances of Charles Withers, Lady Penelope's controlled but taut composure, Mrs. Herring's unwittingly telling gestures, and the subtle clues revealed by the fountain's scuff marks. Each element, isolated, might seem inconsequential, yet together they formed a pattern, a web of human behaviour, tension and secrecy. The key to understanding the morning's tragedy, she realised, lay not in the objects themselves, but in the way people interacted with them, reacted to them, and concealed their true feelings. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Patience, observation, and the quiet reading of human nature would unravel the puzzle in due time. The villagers believed the truth was hidden in the overt, the obvious, yet it was in the subtleties, the fleeting gestures, and the small hesitations that the real story waited to be revealed, and Miss Marple, as always, was prepared to follow it wherever it led. The next morning arrived with a soft drizzle, the clouds heavy over St. Mary's on the Hill, as though the village itself mourned the events of the past days. Rosewood Manor, usually alive with chatter and gentle laughter, was subdued. Even the air seemed laden with anticipation, as if holding its breath for the next revelation. Miss Marple, dressed quietly for her morning walk through the gardens, noted that the damp paths emphasized every footprint, every subtle disturbance in the gravel, making even the smallest detail visible to a patient observer. Inspector Cray had already convened a small gathering in the drawing room, determined to accelerate the investigation. He spoke with authority, outlining what he considered the most probable scenarios, yet Miss Marple noticed that his reasoning relied heavily on assumptions, eyewitness, exaggeration, and visible motives. While he spoke confidently, she catalogued the nervous tics of those around him. The slight avoidance of eye contact, the faint tightening of lips, the restless shifting in seats. People she knew rarely lied with their bodies as much as with their words. Charles Withers remained a focal point in her observations. He had grown more withdrawn since the previous day, speaking only when directly addressed, yet even his silences were telling. Miss Marple noted the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders when questions were directed toward the velvet box, the way his eyes lingered on it, and the subtle flicker of unease when Lady Penelope's gaze briefly met his. Each motion, each hesitation, added to the puzzle, forming a quiet but intricate portrait of a man entwined in more than mere grief. Mrs. Herring, meanwhile, had recovered from the fatigue of the previous day and resumed her habitual rounds, whispering pointed observations to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple, aware of the widow's penchant for exaggeration, listened carefully for the nuggets of truth hidden in her tales. A raised eyebrow, a sudden pause, a tiny shift in posture. All these small signals revealed more than the elaborate narrative Mrs. Herring offered aloud. Miss Marple quietly noted that such unconscious movements often betrayed knowledge or awareness the speaker wished to conceal. By late morning, attention turned toward the velvet box itself. Lady Penelope, having finally removed it from the side table, opened it with careful hands, revealing a wedding ring nestled inside. Its delicate engraving caught the light, a pair of initials intertwined, precise and elegant. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A ring, seemingly simple, could carry enormous significance, and the choice to clutch it so tightly at the moment of death suggested intention, secrecy, or perhaps a final message. The symbolism of such a small object, Miss Marple thought, was often as powerful as any spoken word. As the day progressed, Miss Marple wandered the gardens once more, revisiting the scuff marks and disturbed gravel near the fountain. The patterned set of movements suggested someone had approached deliberately, paused, and then retreated quickly, almost as if they had been interrupted. Coupled with the placement of the velvet box and the subtle reactions of those present, the scene painted a picture of careful orchestration rather than mere accident. The more she observed, the more the interplay of human behaviour revealed itself, each gesture and glance contributing to a silent narrative only she seemed to perceive fully. By afternoon, a new development emerged. A gardener, while tending the flower beds near the east wing, discovered a discarded handkerchief delicately monogrammed but stained faintly with a dark smudge. Miss Marple's mind stirred at once, connecting this seemingly minor clue to the broader picture, the scuff marks at the fountain, Charles Withers' anxiety, Lady Penelope's discreet concern, and Sir Reginald's final grasp of the velvet box. Every detail, no matter how small, hinted at a narrative constructed with care, concealment, and a deeply personal motive. As twilight approached, the manor's rooms glowed with muted lamplight, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Miss Marple, seated near the window, allowed herself a quiet reflection. She understood that the layers of secrecy, tension, and human instinct were beginning to coalesce into a coherent pattern. The truth lay hidden not in the obvious, but in the small, seemingly insignificant gestures that revealed intent, hesitation, and the subtle workings of conscience. And with careful observation, patience, and a keen understanding of human nature, the full story would emerge. Evening had settled over St. Anne. Mary's on the hill with a soft, dusky glow, the sky streaked with violet and gold. Rosewood Manor, usually a hub of bustling activity, lay quiet, though the tension of the past days lingered, like a persistent shadow. Miss Marple moved through the drawing room with her customary calm, observing the remaining household staff as they prepared for supper. Each movement, each hesitated gesture, was catalogued carefully. She had learned that human behaviour, when observed closely, rarely deceived. Charles Withers sat by the fire, seemingly lost in thought, though Miss Marple noted the subtle ways he betrayed his anxiety. His fingers fidgeted intermittently, tapping lightly against the armrest, and his gaze flicked often to the side table where the velvet box had rested earlier. When Lady Penelope entered the room to adjust the curtains, He instinctively straightened his posture, his movements deliberate but tense. Miss Marple understood these small, almost imperceptible reactions. They were the language of guilt, or at least of knowledge one wished to conceal. Lady Penelope herself moved with a careful grace, maintaining her composure as she attended to the few remaining guests. Her hands were steady, yet her eyes revealed fleeting moments of concern, particularly when the conversation drifted towards Sir Reginald's affairs and the contents of the velvet box. Miss Marple, watching quietly from a distant armchair, noted the brief narrowing of her eyes, the subtle pause before answering questions, and the almost imperceptible tightness around her mouth. Such small details often carried greater significance than the spoken words of even the most eloquent villager. Mrs. Herring had resumed her habitual rounds, whispering speculation to anyone who would listen. "It was deliberate," she murmured to the housemaid, her eyes wide with exaggerated certainty. Miss Marple, however, saw through the dramatics, recognizing the nuggets of truth concealed beneath the widow's flair for the theatrical. A glance, a pause, a slight change in tone, these were the clues that revealed more than Mrs. Herring's embellished storytelling. By late evening, Miss Marple's attention returned to the fountain, whose marble edge still bore the faint scuff she had noticed days before. The pattern suggested more than a simple fall. It implied movement, hesitation, and possibly confrontation. Coupled with the recently discovered handkerchief monogrammed and stained, the scene began to reveal a subtle narrative. It was a narrative of deliberate actions, concealed intentions, and human behaviour observed under pressure. Miss Marple stood and wandered to the veranda, the cool night air brushing her face. She observed the village beyond the manor's walls, faint lights twinkling through the drizzle. Something in the stillness seemed pregnant with possibility. Often, she reflected, the final piece of understanding came not from the loudest statements or most obvious evidence, but from quiet observation, the little things others dismissed as trivial. A fleeting glance, a hesitation, the way a hand rests on a railing, these details spoke volumes to those who could read them. As she returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Charles Withers now pacing lightly, a subtle restlessness to his steps that suggested internal conflict. Lady Penelope's movements remained meticulous, yet the tension in her shoulders, the careful avoidance of certain topics, and the discreet attention she paid to Withers did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Even Mrs. Herring's seemingly casual remarks contained echoes of knowledge, hidden within exaggeration and theatricality. Miss Marple settled back into her chair with a quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was beginning to clarify, each observation from the past days threading together into an emerging pattern. Human behaviour, with all its contradictions, hesitations, and subtle gestures, was beginning to reveal the truth. The answers lay not in overt accusations or dramatic confessions, but in the careful reading of the people around her. And as the manor's lights dimmed and night deepened, Miss Marple prepared herself for the subtle tests and revelations that would soon illuminate the final hidden threads of Sir Reginald's demise. Morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Rosewood Manor, casting delicate patterns across the polished wooden floors. The air carried a quiet anticipation, as if the house itself knew that the threads of the past days were beginning to pull taut. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a cup of tea, observed the household with her usual quiet attentiveness. Even in the ordinary movements of servants preparing breakfast, she noted small gestures, the hesitant glance, the slight pause in speech, the careful avoidance of certain tasks that hinted at unease far deeper than any words would reveal. Charles Withers had remained in the drawing room, ostensibly reviewing letters and documents, yet his hands betrayed a subtle restlessness. Miss Marple watched as he adjusted his cuff repeatedly, glanced toward the side table where the velvet box had once rested, and shifted in his chair with a deliberate tension. It was a dance of control and concealment, each minor movement speaking to an inner conflict he could not entirely suppress. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance, aware that such unconscious behaviours often revealed more than any confession might. Lady Penelope entered shortly after, her movements as graceful and deliberate as ever. Yet Miss Marple noticed a flicker in her expression, a brief tightening around the eyes when she noticed Charles observing her. There was a subtle negotiation in her posture, a careful weighing of words and gestures as she moved through the room. Even the most composed individuals, Miss Marple reflected, often revealed themselves in the smallest of signals that could unlock truths otherwise hidden. Mrs. Herring, energized despite the previous day's excitement, flitted once more through the household. She murmured observations to anyone within earshot, embellishing facts and weaving conjecture into a tapestry of rumour. Yet even in her exaggerations, Miss Marple detected details that aligned with the quiet evidence she had been collecting. Fleeting glances, nervous reactions, and the occasional slip of truth wrapped in dramatic narration. These hints, while subtle, provided critical insight into relationships, motives, and unspoken tensions among the manor's residents. By mid-morning, Miss Marple decided to revisit the fountain, her mind returning to the scuff marks and disturbed gravel that had first caught her attention days earlier. The faint indentation, the direction of the gravel, and the placement of the footprints suggested a precise sequence of movements, approach, hesitation, retreat, that indicated deliberation rather than accident. Coupled with the monogrammed handkerchief discovered by the gardener, a portrait began to emerge, one of careful orchestration, concealed intentions, and human behaviours, revealing truths the villagers themselves were unaware of. As she returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple observed a quiet interaction between Lady Penelope and Charles. Their conversation was polite, measured, and outwardly innocuous, yet she noted the subtle exchange of glances, the hesitation in response, and the slight tightening of hands. Upon the table, such minor cues were rarely accidental. They were the language of people balancing truth, guilt, and secrecy. Miss Marple considered the velvet box once more, now an essential silent witness to the tensions that lingered between them. Later, the household settled into a muted calm, with servants moving quietly about and the few remaining guests occupying themselves with reading or idle conversation. Miss Marple sipped her tea, reflecting on the collected observations. Charles Withers' restrained anxiety, Lady Penelope's controlled tension, Mrs. Herring's inadvertent clues, and the physical evidence around the fountain. Each element, examined in isolation, might appear trivial, but together they formed an intricate web pointing toward motives, relationships, and concealed truths. As the morning light deepened into noon, Miss Marple allowed herself a small contemplative smile. The threads were aligning, the picture was becoming clearer, and soon the subtle psychological tests she intended to observe would reveal the heart of the mystery. The truth lay not in dramatic accusations or overt confessions, but in the careful observation of human behaviour, patience, and the understanding of the hidden currents running through the village. And Miss Marple, with her quiet acuity, was ready to follow them wherever they led. By mid-afternoon, Rosewood Manor seemed to exist in a delicate balance between calm and tension, each guest and household member moving with careful attention to the invisible currents of suspicion and secrecy. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing room, observed with her usual serenity, noting the small telling details that others overlooked entirely. The day's observations promised clarity, provided she could interpret them with patience and subtlety. Charles Withers had grown increasingly restless. He moved from window to window, occasionally glancing toward the fountain visible through the glass, as if drawn by memory or dread. Each step was deliberate, measured, yet there was a faint tremor in his gestures, a tension in his shoulders. Miss Marple watched quietly, cataloguing the subtle signs of inner conflict. She understood that his behaviour, restrained though it was, revealed a preoccupation with events that went far beyond polite concern. Lady Penelope, for her part, remained the picture of controlled composure, yet Miss Marple detected the minutest cues of unease, the slight pause before speaking, the fleeting narrowing of her eyes, the delicate shift in posture when Charles moved too close. Even those who appeared most composed often betrayed their true feelings through gesture and tone, and Miss Marple knew that these understated signals frequently revealed more than words ever could. Mrs. Herring, ever the dramatic observer, flitted about the room with whispered conjectures and pointed remarks. "I saw him by the fountain again," she murmured to a servant, her tone conspiratorial, "and I dare say he seemed troubled." Miss Marple, listening carefully, noted the unconscious truths hidden in the widow's words, the choice of location, the timing of observation, the emphasis on emotional reaction. These subtle hints, buried beneath Mrs. Herring's flair for drama, provided valuable insight into the movements and intentions of those involved. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manor, Miss Marple turned her attention once more to the velvet box. Though its contents, a delicate wedding ring, appeared simple, its symbolism and timing suggested deeper significance. The box had been clutched tightly in Sir Reginald's final moments, indicating urgency or a desire to communicate something hidden. The careful consideration of its placement and the reactions it provoked among the household offered Miss Marple yet another layer of understanding about motive and concealed intentions. Later she ventured toward the fountain, her steps deliberate and measured. The scuff marks and disturbed gravel provided a silent narrative of movement, hesitation, and perhaps confrontation. The monogrammed handkerchief discovered nearby added weight to this emerging story. By observing how these physical traces interacted with the behaviours and reactions of the household members, Miss Marple could begin to reconstruct not only the sequence of events but also the underlying motivations that had led to tragedy. By evening, the household had settled into a muted quiet, each guest lost in thought or idle activity. Miss Marple, seated once more with a cup of tea, reflected on the cumulative observations: Charles Withers' restless anxiety, Lady Penelope's discreet tension, Mrs. Herring's inadvertent clues, the physical traces at the fountain, and the velvet box's silent testimony. Each of these elements, when considered together, wove a tapestry of human behaviour, motives, and concealed intentions. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint contemplative smile. The threads were converging. The subtle psychological tests she had been conducting, watching reactions, noting hesitations, observing glances and gestures, were beginning to yield clarity. The truth, she knew, would reveal itself not through overt confession, but through careful attention to human nature, patience, and insight. And soon she resolved the full story of Sir Reginald's death would emerge in a manner both precise and inevitable. Night had fallen over Rosewood Manor, casting long shadowed patterns across the polished floors and the well-kept gardens beyond. The manor, once filled with the hushed murmurs of speculation, now lay in a tense stillness, punctuated only by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant call of an owl. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a cup of tea, allowed her mind to sift through the observations she had made over the past days. Every glance, hesitation, and subtle gesture had been catalogued with care, forming a delicate lattice of human behaviour and hidden motives. Charles Withers paced quietly in the drawing-room, his movements meticulous yet restless. Miss Marple noted the same minor tics she had observed in the morning: finger-tapping, shifting weight, and glances toward the faint outline of the velvet box which now rested in Lady Penelope's possession. Each motion hinted at preoccupation, unease, and perhaps knowledge that he had yet to confess. She observed how he approached the fireplace, then paused mid-step as if weighing the implications of his own actions, revealing a mind caught between caution and anxiety. Lady Penelope, maintaining her composure, moved carefully about the room, performing small tasks to occupy herself. Yet Miss Marple noted fleeting signs of tension, a slight tightening of her lips, an almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes, and a deliberate avoidance of certain topics in conversation. Even in her apparent calm, the careful control of expression betrayed internal worry. Miss Marple's practised eye recognised that such subtle cues often spoke louder than overt accusations. Mrs. Herring had, predictably, resumed her rounds, whispering half-observed facts and pointed conjectures to anyone within earshot. Miss Marple listened, filtering the embellishments from the kernels of truth. The widow's sharp eye and unconscious gestures occasionally betrayed details that no one else noticed. A pause at a certain word, a glance toward a corner, a fleeting lift of them. Eyebrows. These small, seemingly trivial signs were precisely what Miss Marple relied upon to interpret human behaviour, revealing secrets that the loudest statements often obscured. By late evening, Miss Marple determined it was time to test the reactions of those involved, observing them under subtle, controlled circumstances. She suggested a quiet walk through the gardens, ostensibly to enjoy the evening air, but with the underlying intention of observing behaviour away from the formalities of the drawing-room. Charles Withers followed, slightly hesitant, his posture rigid yet watchful. Lady Penelope joined, maintaining composure while masking a faint unease. Even Mrs. Herring, trailing slightly behind, seemed acutely aware of the tension in the air. Near the fountain, Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift casually, speaking of trivial matters: the flowers, the change in weather, the simple beauty of the water's surface. Yet every word, every glance was carefully chosen to provoke subtle responses. She watched Charles closely, noting the brief stiffening of his hands, the almost imperceptible gulp, and the tension in his jaw as he glanced at the marble edge. Lady Penelope, meanwhile, revealed nothing overtly, yet her subtle posture shifts and faint tightening of fingers betrayed her concern when the fountain and the velvet box were indirectly referenced. As the night deepened, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settling within her. The web of clues, Charles Withers' restless anxiety, Lady Penelope's taut control, Mrs. Herring's inadvertent revelations, the scuff marks by the fountain, and the monogrammed handkerchief was beginning to coalesce. Human behaviour, carefully observed and interpreted, had revealed the story in ways that no forensic detail alone could convey. The stage was set, the psychological threads in place, and the final moment of revelation was drawing near. The manor was unusually silent that evening. The household gathered in the drawing-room, as though aware that the day's lingering tension would finally find resolution. Miss Marple, Shema, with her calm demeanour and quiet observance, allowed the others to settle while she considered the strands of behaviour, hesitation and subtle indication that had accumulated over the past week. Each fragment, from the scuff marks by the fountain to Charles Withers's anxious movements, to Lady Penelope's careful composure, had its place in the emerging picture of Sir Reginald's death. "Charles," Miss Marple began gently, her tone light and unassuming, "I wonder if you might recall the exact moment you last saw Sir Reginald this morning at the fountain." Her voice, soft and conversational, carried a subtle weight, inviting careful reflection rather than accusation. Charles shifted slightly, fingers tightening in his lap. I saw him approaching the fountain, yes," he admitted, voice hesitant. "He seemed troubled holding the box. That's all, really." Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the velvet box on the side table. "And this box?" she asked, allowing her gaze to linger meaningfully. "It contained a very particular ring, did it not? One intended for someone quite special?" Charles swallowed, eyes darting toward Lady Penelope, whose expression remained composed, though her fingers clenched almost imperceptibly. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Sir Reginald's final moments were not as random as they first appeared. The scuff marks near the fountain, the disturbed gravel, the position in which he fell, all these were the result of a deliberate intervention, yet one intended to appear accidental, and the handkerchief monogrammed and left in haste was the telltale clue overlooked by everyone else." Her gaze turned slowly to Lady Penelope. "You were aware, were you not, that Sir Reginald intended to leave something behind, something deeply personal?" Lady Penelope's fingers twitched, a faint tightening of the jaw. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "but it was nothing sinister, only wished to preserve his wishes." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "Indeed, your intentions were protective, yet the one who misunderstood or miscalculated the situation was young Charles. Your anxiety, Charles, your repeated glances at the fountain, the box, your hesitation when Lady Penelope spoke, all pointed to an attempt to interfere. You thought to secure the ring before anyone else could see it to prevent complications, and in doing so you startled Sir Reginald, leading to the unfortunate scuffle near the fountain, which resulted in his fatal fall." Charles's face paled, realization dawning. I didn't mean for it to happen. I only wanted to—" His voice faltered, shaking. Miss Marple reached out a hand, her voice calm but firm. "Intent, young man, is often very different from an outcome. The evidence lay not in rage or malice, but in behaviour. Hesitation, concealment, subtle movements, things that reveal true motives more clearly than force or fury ever could." Mrs. Herring's eyes widened, her dramatic tendencies replaced by a stunned silence. Lady Penelope, her posture relaxing, let out a quiet sigh of relief. Miss Marple, allowing a brief pause, continued, "The velvet box, Charles's anxiety, Lady Penelope's composure, the scuff marks, the handkerchief, all these pieces aligned once, observed through human behaviour. It was not a crime of malice, but of panic and misunderstanding." The room exhaled collectively. Charles, still trembling, nodded mutely, accepting both responsibility and the fact that no ill intent had driven his actions. Lady Penelope moved to steady him, while Mrs. Herring muttered under her breath, astonished at how the entire affair had unravelled, without scandal or accusation. Miss Marple leaned back, serene as ever. She reflected on the curious intricacies of human nature, how anxiety, secrecy, and misplaced intentions could weave a web that seemed incomprehensible until carefully unravelled. And in the quiet of Rosewood Manor, the village's rhythm slowly resumed, the mystery resolved, leaving only a faint memory of tension, now replaced by the subtle reassurance that understanding and observation rather than rash judgment had revealed the truth.